From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. This is Said and Done. I'm Chris Kaiser, and joining me is Reyes Llopis-García from Columbia's Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures. In this conversation, we talk about cognitive linguistics, what it is, and some ways in which concepts from this field of study can be applied in the language classroom. We also discuss a book that she recently published, Applied Cognitive Linguistics and L2 Instruction in the Cambridge Elements series. Here's my conversation with Reyes Llopis-García. Reyes Llopis-García, you are a senior lecturer in Spanish in the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures at Columbia. You're a cognitive linguist and a teacher trainer, and you have published extensively, in particular in the areas of cognitive linguistics and Spanish language instruction. And you've recently published a book in the Cambridge Elements series titled Applied Cognitive Linguistics and L2 Instruction, and I will include information about this book in the show notes so anybody who's interested can find out how to access that book. So first of all, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. I'm looking forward very much to speaking with you.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here, and thanks for including me in this fantastic series that you're building.
Absolutely. So I read your book. I maybe should read it a second time, but I very much enjoyed my first read of it. And it's really about this idea of how to look at language learning, how to approach it, and how to incorporate in language pedagogy some elements of what you might call the cognitive linguistics approach to language teaching and learning. So can you describe generally what that is, what that means, just as sort of a first step?
Yes. So cognitive linguistics is a very broad field, and it includes not only the discipline of cognitive linguistics, but like other disciplines within, like construction grammar or pedagogy approaches like the one I work with, like applied cognitive linguistics, but also very abstract theories. And it's kind of like a compound of different approaches, and anyone can go into any of these. So it's kind of a blend of cognitive sciences. And then you go into the niche that you need. So I have been working with cognitive linguistics since the mid-2000s, I believe, and the discipline is not much older than that, to be honest. It's cognitive grammar and cognitive linguistics as fields emerged in the 1980s, but the first seminal publications and books and volumes on applied cognitive linguistics, the term was actually coined in 2018. But the first approaches to second language learning, second language acquisition, second language instruction came at the beginning of the 2000s. So it's fairly new as a discipline, and there is extensive work already published and everything, but also a lot to do still. So in what cognitive linguistics applies to what we do in the language classroom is, or what cognitive linguistics would say does in the broader sense, is it's a relationship between language and the mind. And it goes on to say that language is not a specific skill. There's no language acquisition device like we've been hearing from generative linguistics for so long, but it's embedded in our general cognitive abilities, like categorization. Like humans categorize things into like neat and not so neat categories, and ideas and memory and concepts, and the way we understand concepts and the way we conceptualize the environment around us. So from a cognitive linguistics perspective, your actual environment, your actual physical surroundings, and the physical memory of the discourse community you're in is what gives rise to the linguistic structure of the language that you speak. So that has huge implications for the language class. And there are many concepts that come from that, like categorization that I mentioned, or embodiment or embodied language, perspective, the notion of prototypes to talk about core meanings in linguistic structures and grammatical structures. So it is a different way to approach language, but it's also a very familiar way to approach language because as a kid, as a baby, when you're born, way before you are able to utter a word, you've been interacting with your surroundings. You've been processing when you're in your crib. There's a mobile, and you're like spend hours looking at that mobile and determining how things move in space. The proximity of your caretaker is what announces like that you're getting care or that you're getting an interaction. So you tend to see warmth, for instance, as the physical warmth of your caretaker as something good, or you tend to see cold as the literal physical absence of that warmth. So there's a lot of these concepts from early interactions with your environment that actually make it into the language, from that core physical embodied experience, and make it into abstract figurative understandings of the language. Like when you say that you and somebody have a close relationship, you like shorten that distance literally, right? Or if somebody's being distant with you, they're giving you the cold shoulder. Like all of this, there are so many expressions, so many things that are in the language that you're gesturing way before you're saying, there's a doggy there, but like the gesture happens, and you point from your person to somewhere else. So that will determine later how prepositions are going to work and how they're all rooted in physical perspectives. So bringing this into the classroom is a new way of thinking, but also a familiar way of thinking, because students have been doing this in their first language and in other languages they speak. So they have a competence there that you have to tap into. And once you do, it's kind of fun to see how it develops in the language classroom.
Yeah, I think that one challenge that I felt when I was teaching a language, I used to teach Italian before I worked here at the Language Center, and we kind of treated language as an abstract system that was devoid from the human experience. We were in a
Yes.
classroom, which was already a kind of sterile environment, and we tended to do a lot of describing grammar, describing things with a lot of, terminology and descriptions. And I feel like what you're saying, it kind of is more um, true to the way that I feel language actually exists, which is, the language it comes from the mind. The mind is linked to a body. So it's just a more accurate reflection of how language exists for us as humans in the world. And does that does that make sense according to what you're saying in your book and what you think?
It makes perfect sense. I also learned to teach Spanish this way. And I remember, sweat running down my back when, I explained some rule of grammar in the classroom. And then, a hand from a student went up to like ask a counter question. And I was like, no, I'm not going to know how to explain this because what you're saying is that, yes, the class is already a sterile environment. It's already a closely controlled environment of learning. And the four walls of the classroom are very limiting in many senses. But then, most market ready textbooks that we have present grammar in a very, would say, mechanical way, or in a very like hygiene concentrated way. It's very simple, and I do this air quotes because you have like grammar tables at the end of the unit where you're like studying only these rules and only for that, and there's always like a rule and then exceptions and all that, and you have this way of working with this presentation practice production that has been around since the 1980s or the 1970s, where you say, okay, we're going to learn the conditional. So, or the future, and the future is a simple tense. And then that's what it is. And then it means it's a simple tense to talk about the future. and then you go from there to use. And then you have like a list of usages, and these usages are not even learned at the same time. You have one use in like chapter 4, and then the next use of the feature appears again in chapter 10, and then another one appears again, not even only in different chapters, but also across levels of competence. And you end up like with the Spanish subjunctive, for instance, you end up with the idea that the subjunctive is everywhere and you're never going to know when to use it because it just shows up and pops up at any minute, and you weren't using it in the 3 courses you took before. So why now everything is about that? So there's a big disconnect between the way you learn the language and the way the language appears in the wild, in real life. So approaching because I always go to the verbal system because it's always kind of what vertebrates the language curriculum. Where are you? What are you teaching? I'm teaching level A2, and maybe you don't know what level A2 is if you're not familiar with the European framework. But maybe you don't know because you don't know axful. But if you say I'm teaching the preterit and the imperfect, people are going to be like, okay, I know where you are. So the verbal system kind of integrates all of this, and instead of like approaching a tense as in, okay, this is what this tense is going to do. And then once you know what this core meaning of that particular tense or that particular mood selection is, you can like start creating what's called like a radial network, just like a sort of like by using metaphors and metonymies, which are cognitive operations of the first order, you can start extending that semantic network. But always coming back to that same prototype. So it's like having Ariadne's red thread to guide you through the labyrinth of uses. Like you can always come back to the prototype to see what the relationship is. So this creates lots of problems for the language instructor and sometimes for the students who are used to this way that you describe of learning, right? But once those hurdles are, overcome, then it just creates an entirely new, more fun, I would say, more fun, more entertaining, more logical, if you will, way of approaching the language, and by which you always have a safety raft to come back to.
Yeah. So, when I was both a language learner and then a language teacher, I found there are some, the language that I engaged with was Italian, which is similar in many ways to Spanish. I found there are some things that you can just kind of get just like that. Like for an English speaker, it just makes sense. But there's other things where no matter how many rules, no matter how much describing you do of something, it doesn't really make sense in that kind of grammatical way. It makes sense in other ways. And so I was wondering, maybe we can look at one or two things from the book that you just published and kind of talk about how you present certain things that don't really make a lot of sense in the sort of meta-linguistic way, but maybe in other ways they make sense. And so if you're listening right now on the podcast app, just as an audio, you can go over to the YouTube channel that we have, and you can find the diagram that I'm about to pull up. So let me.
That's pretty cool.
So let me pull up one thing that I found in your book that I really liked. And this is, so go, maybe you can describe what these two things are and how they differ from one another.
Sure. So what we see on figures 38A and B on the left of the screen, if you're looking straight at it, is what traditional instruction is. And I will say this for the record, that traditional instruction is a loaded term. And if you're coming in from pedagogy, or you're coming in from second language acquisition, or you're coming in from applied cognitive linguistics, there are differing views of things. And you know how linguists like to tangle up in small discussions, and traditional instruction is one. Let's just call traditional instruction anything that's not applied cognitive linguistics instruction. But usually it is like somewhat of a notional functional grammar methodology approach type thing. So what we have in A above is this kind of presentation thing, this like inductive way of teaching, or like showing the students what the structure is. So you use input enhancement, it could be colors, or in this case, it could be bold writing. It's like, hola Clara, hi Clara, how are you? I'm well, I'm having a coffee because I love it. And then this I love it is going to be highlighted somehow. And then, oh, I like coffee too. Hey, I'm thinking that, Americans and Spanish have a lot of things in common. So I like to eat meat. And what about you? Like, it also feels a little manufactured. So, but this is like adapted from a textbook, from a real textbook. We just didn't put it verbatim because of copyright issues, but it is adapted from a real textbook. So you present this to the student, and with that input enhancement, it's like, okay, so what are you seeing here? And, you kind of let the students make deductions about what it is or what kind of structure it has. And then you show them B, the image in B, which has a grammar table for those listening and not viewing, that has just how it's built, how the verbs of emotion, as we call them, how they're built. So I like, when in English you say, I like John's car, we say in Spanish, John's car is pleasing to me. So there is a completely different, it's not subject, verb, object. It is like kind of object, verb, subject. And the subject and the object are reversed. So you're not the person performing the action, you're the person receiving what the action means. So there's usually not a lot of talk about this, and there's a lot of very heavy meta language where students need to know what a direct object is, or what an indirect object is, and what the verb is, and the subject and the predicate and all that. And at least in our case at Columbia University in higher education, we have a whole lot of students who have not come from a background that informs or has informed to them what an object versus a subject is. So when you have these like heavy meta-linguistic approaches to language teaching or language learning, sometimes it's the students need to learn language or learn about language and then learn the actual language. So this is what the traditional approach has. But again, we're talking about higher ed. I am not reaching out to other contexts of instruction, because that would be a crass generalization, and I can't do that. But for the purpose of higher ed and most language textbooks in higher ed, like, this is the way it looks. On the right, however, we have the cognitive instruction here, where we start by explaining what normal, in air quotes, normal verbs are versus verbs of emotion. So we don't even use the meta language of like periphrastic or anything that will like trigger this meta language and awareness of the inner workings of language. We don't want to do that. So this was an animated presentation, so you can't see it as animated, obviously, but the arrows are moving the whole time, and the little lines that surround every character in the verbs of emotion, they are also blinking, so you get a lot of like embodied elements that are not there as freeloaders. They're there to impact on the perception and the understanding of the students. So we have I cook a lot on the normal column, and then I love to cook in the emotional, or verbs of emotion, not emotional, in a verbs of emotion column, where I cook a lot has a performative subject, the person who cooks, I. Whereas in I like to cook, cooking is what's pleasing to me. I am receiving the semantics of the verb. So there are all these examples. There are 3 examples of each where what's normal has been built into what's a verb of emotion. And then it says, okay, if they're different verbs, then they have a different structure. So we do include this like object, verb, subject ideas. And as you can see in the image below, 31B, it says experiencer and receiver of emotion. But because this was part of an empirical study that was gathering actual data, and we had a traditional group and a cognitive group, you also see there grammatical subject and object. So you see that meta language there to like address both groups. But it talks about who's performing the idea of the verb. Like who's like, I like this class. In Spanish is this class is pleasing to me. So this class is actually creating an emotion, which is liking in this case, and that liking is being received by me. So whatever is happening, whatever has power over you, like I love cats, cats are performing the action of liking and you're receiving that action. So you're being impacted by that. And that's why the arrow points towards the person who is receiving that emotion. And the same thing goes with, I hate cats. Or I'm afraid of spiders, where the Spanish language constructs spiders, like the creator of the emotion is so powerful that it gets the credit of being the performative subject in the sentence. So spiders are terrifying to me would be how we construct that. And we try to motivate, and by motivation in the sense of cognitive linguistics, it means that the core embodied meaning is, figures as a way to understand the figurative meaning. So we try to motivate these verbs, and you try to motivate what spiders are, or what cats are, or what cooking is to you, and how in the expression of emotion you are the one impacted by the power that these objects and these things and these people have over you. So it's different.
I loved this diagram so much, and I loved this approach so much, because when I would teach Italian, we had a similar verb for to like. Like in English, you say I like coffee. It's normal, but in Italian, it's mi piace il caffè. So it is. So literally, the coffee is pleasing to me, and so I think as a learner, like first of all, nobody would understand this when I would try to explain it to them, just in the way that you showed on the left-hand column, which was the traditional, here's like a bunch of examples, try to understand this. It was like nothing. But to me, when you're showing me this, like the arrow that's pointing to me, like the liking is done like to me, or to him or to her, like just sort of internalizing the weight of that arrow cognitively. That's the path that you have to follow to understand what this means, what this construction means in Italian or in Spanish. And then that deep feeling of that arrow is what you need in order to produce sentences using that structure, right. in my opinion. I don't know. I'll let you react to that statement.
No, it is exactly like that. So we're trying to create the theater of language, I guess, where there are actual actors acting out grammatical parts. And you want to see that arrow. And when you want to say, I like coffee, it's not you doing the liking. It's that something is powerful enough to act out their essence, and that essence will have an impact on you. It might be liking, it might be disliking, it might be bothering, it might be fearing. So the verbs of emotion, like mi piace in Italian, or me gusta, even German has the same structure for that. It is embodying what other things do to us, and how we're not necessarily the only actors in our life and in the way we talk. So what we want is for students to visualize grammar, and from that visualization, then make decisions that impact how they produce the language, instead of just memorizing that diagram that we saw on the left that has like a mí, me, and then the verb gusta, and then the whatever actor that is, and that becomes the subject. And also the subject is at the end, and then you're the object, but you're in the beginning. So it's really hard to parse in a different way. It's really hard to parse from abstract ideas. It is a lot easier, or a lot more meaningful, if you will, to parse from visualization of what the language actually means, and the language structures and parts.
Absolutely. If you're in a conversation in Spanish with some people that you've gotten to know and you're speaking Spanish with, and you're an English speaker like me, if they're asking you, what do you like? What type of food do you like? Whatever. If you're trying to answer that while imagining that diagram, the conversation's over. So you
Yeah,
have
good
to.
luck.
um, so on that same line, I was wondering if we could take another look at something that I loved from your book, which is another very challenging structure for English speakers learning Spanish or Italian to get, and you can talk about it until the cows come home, or you can kind of present it in a different way. And that's the sort of contrast between the imperfect tense and then the preterite tense in Spanish. In Italian, it would be called the passato prossimo or
Yes,
passato remoto. But yes, same general idea.
yes.
So what is this? What is the difference between these two tenses, and how are you sort of
I
helping
have
to
the book
explain
right
this to
here.
people? Okay.
So what we have here is a prototype that I was talking about earlier, which is the core meaning of something. And this core meaning in this case is based on space and the spatial perspective of the speaker. So the speaker is the little guy that you have there with the, what's that called?
Telescope,
A telescope, right? The spying glass.
spyglass.
So spyglass, right? Yeah, that's the word. Thank you. So the position of the observer slash speaker is what's going to determine where in the prototype we find ourselves. So the prototype has a speaker, which can also be the observer if you're narrating in the third person. You have a mental space, which is the story you're telling, and then you have the duration of the action, which is basically aspect. It's the aspectual contrast between each one of those simple tenses to talk about the past in Spanish. So the first one says ongoing information about an action in the past, and it is an identical twin to the present. And when I tell this to my students, there's like a, you know, that emoji that has an exploding head. There's an exploding head moment of like, whoa. So whatever you say in the present, using the present tense, you can say it in the past tense and you're going to be using the imperfect. It has the exact same meaning. They're like identical twins. So in this case, you're going to be within the action. You're going to travel in time and you're going to position yourself as an observer within an action that's unfolding in real time, but in the past. So the mental space of the action is then open-ended because you're just watching. It's like a GIF, really. You're just watching something happening on a loop. So the aspectual part of it is the duration as it happens in the past. So there, a lot of people talk about finished versus unfinished, but it is an action in the past. So it's kind of weird to talk about unfinished when you're saying something that happened already, right? So if you position the speaker in the action as it happens, then you're not seeing, and let's keep in mind that we're talking about one verb, not the whole story. Mm-hmm. So when you say ran and use the imperfect, which in Spanish would be corría, you're only seeing the action of running unfolding. You're not seeing the whole story. Like, this is why in one story, the preterit and the imperfect mix all the time. Every action gets their own prototype. So in the case of corría, in the imperfect, the only thing you're seeing is a loop of somebody running, but you don't see where the person is going to. You don't see what happens next. You're inside of the story watching that action unfold. So that's the imperfect. Then the preterit positions, as you can see in the image B, the observer or speaker outside of that mental space. So there's already distance. And because there's distance, you can see the full duration of the action, which you can't in the first part, where if you see the blue dots or the blue lines kind of they get interrupted by the end of the mental space. But in the case of the preterit, that mental space is there and the duration of the action, the start, the duration, and the finish, they're there for you to see. So it is completed. It has a beginning, a development, and an ending to it. So we are independent observers having seen that. So that is the breakdown of it. And if you go to the figure 17, this would be something that I would work with my students in class. So the first two images that we looked at were part of empirical studies that I've done in the classroom and that I've published elsewhere. But this is what I might use in my everyday class when I'm not, performing for applied linguistics. I'm just teaching language, right? Where, she had short hair can be construed both ways with the imperfect and the preterit. But she had short hair, you're seeing her and you can see that the observer is within the mental space, and then the person with the short hair is a lot bigger because this is what you're concentrating on. Whereas in the other one, where you're using the preterit, first of all, you're bigger because you're here, and your here is more important. That's where you're located, literally located, narrating. And then the person over there has short hair, but in the here. And that's where the arrow with the other three little images go. Like in the present, you don't know. When you're using the preterit, you don't know what it is like today. Is it a bob? Is it short? Is it very long? Like you don't know. It's not implied at all. So that's how I visualize it with my students. And then we actually make embodied representation of that. And that is also something that comes from cognitive linguistics, which is the concept of boundary crossing, which is when you actually literally have a frontier that you have to cross. Like, for instance, when you enter a classroom, when you go into a space, there is an actual threshold that you cross. So if we embody this in the classroom and say, she crossed the threshold, but we embody it and we document it with actual movement in the classroom. If we use the imperfect, we're stuck in the threshold. We're neither in nor out. We're playing a loop where she entraba por la puerta. She's stuck in the threshold, which is not a good place to be stuck in, unless for your narration purposes it is. But if you say cruzó o entró por la puerta, then the action of being outside of the door, crossing the threshold and coming into the classroom, that is completed, and that will be your preterit. So when you write or when you speak on your own outside of this exercise in the classroom, choose your fighter. Which one are you going to be? Are you going to be stuck in the threshold, which is great? Or are you going to be great for your purpose of narration, that is? Or are you going to be moving the action along and finishing that particular verb, finishing that particular action?
Yeah. I think this is great. And I think that kind of casting yourself into these sort of visual scenarios and imagining, am I in the same bubble as this person in the past, or am I standing outside of that person's bubble? That will probably more likely, and I'm sure you've found this, more likely cause the learner to produce the correct form rather than a whole paragraph explaining what the difference is between the two.
Yes, and also sometimes no. Okay. I mean, there's no magic cure. This is not snake oil for the language classroom. This has its own difficulties as well, because also it implies thinking a lot. And not all the students want to do that. Some students are very, very comfortable with their grammar tables and their exams with fill in the blank and multiple choice, and that's what they want. But I would say, in my professional experience, the majority of students actually do want to understand what they're doing and do want to be attain some kind of fluency, and they have an objective for being in the language classroom other than the language requirement of the university. So there is a transition period in which they really have to learn how to think critically about the language. And then there's also a transition period of am I visualizing this? Am I visualizing it right? Am I not? Do I have to embody this? So it takes longer for the students to actually start using it in a more meaningful way. And this also connects, but I think this is also a different episode of the podcast of what is the difference between teaching for language use and teaching for language assessment? Are you teaching to complete an exam, or are you teaching to actually make decisions outside of the classroom walls? So in my particular case, in my particular university and language program, there is the balance of both, and we have to balance between one and the other, and sometimes it gets tricky. But yes, I would say in all the years that I've been teaching cognitive linguistics, which, they're adding up at this point, it is more positive than not. And the students are more confident in their usage of the language, and they're more excited to produce language than in the more traditional, again, air quotes, in the more traditional ways of just language is an object of study, and this is how the language works, and this is how you learn. And there's gotta be, in my opinion, there's gotta be more of how do you say this in your language? let's see how you say this in English. And now let's see how Spanish does it. And hey, look at this. So the conceptualization is very similar, but the construal, so how it is expressed verbally, is different. Why is that difference? Why do we do this? Why do Germans use verbs of motion in to use the present perfect instead of like the verb to have, like everybody else does? Or why does Spanish and Italian use mi piace el café, me gusta el café? Or what, if you bring in that kind of exercise of like, how do you say this in your language and how do you say this in the other language, and what are the differences, and what is the semantic value of the linguistic structures that either language is using, motivating that and understanding that has better chances, and this is empirically proven too, has better chances of forming an actual link in memorization and in understanding and in ultimately retrieval in like real time of the structures when the students are producing language in the wild, even outside of class.
I can easily see that. Having read your book, I can easily see how that would be the case. So I know you have to go in a very short time, and I thank you for speaking with me. In this conversation, we really looked at a few examples that in some degree exemplify some of the concepts that you talk about in your book, concepts like embodied understanding, metaphorical competence, and deforeignizing. And so I would encourage anybody who wishes to go deeper to check out this book, and also anybody who's a language teacher who wants to learn about how to begin to apply some of these concepts within their language pedagogy to take a look at the Applied Cognitive Linguistics and L2 instruction book, which I'll link to in the show notes. Reyes, is there anything that you want to add to that?
Well, a big thank you to everybody who listened and viewed, but also just to say that the book is not very long, because that is what the Elements series of Cambridge University Press is trying to do. So it's not a difficult, or I hope not, a difficult read. It's not dense. It's meant to be for language instructors and for graduate students and language learners even. But the book is full of examples, and it links to a bunch of digital resources as well. The examples are from Spanish because that's what I teach, but there is an explicit invitation in the book for anybody to reuse these materials, to take these materials and change them and apply them to their classroom. So my hope and my idea in writing this book was to reach the language teaching community, be it students or instructors, and to make the theoretical linguistics, which sometimes is dense and not that accessible to anyone with an interest in it. So I hope that's what I hope to achieve anyway. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this book, and very happy to talk any further about anything related to this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Reyes. And I can say, having read the book myself, that if I were teaching still, which I wish I still could, it would be I could very easily see how I could incorporate some of the things that you say into my teaching. So really, yeah, I totally agree that this is a great book for language teachers to think about how to apply this in their classes. So Reyes, thank you again. I really appreciated the time that you've spent with me today.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'll see you soon.